A black man gets arrested on a quiet street for simply walking. What the officers didn't know is, he was their boss. What happens next explodes into a national scandal and turns a city upside down. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. If you think this couldn't happen in your neighborhood, think again. Stay with us until the end to see how one man's calm courage sparked a movement that could change everything. Hit like, subscribe, and be part of a community that refuses to look away. It's easy to look at what happened to Marcus Reed and think it's just one of those rare, unfortunate incidents. One man. One bad day. One mistake by a single officer. But that would be missing the point entirely. This story isn't just about Marcus. It's not just about Officer Kelly Turner, either. What happened on that quiet, tree-lined street in Savannah wasn't a random accident. It was the result of something that's been building for years, decades, even. A system that's been allowed to function in a way that quietly, consistently, and dangerously fails the very people it's supposed to protect. Marcus wasn't a threat. He wasn't causing trouble. He was simply walking through a neighborhood, enjoying his day. But to Officer Turner, that was enough to raise suspicion. Why? Because he didn't look like he belonged. That single, flawed thought set off a chain of events that pulled back the curtain on something much bigger. And as uncomfortable as it might be to admit, this happens more often than we'd like to believe. People are judged by the way they look, where they are, or what someone thinks they might be doing. Not based on their actions, but based on assumptions. That's why this story hit so many people in such a personal way. It revealed something many folks have felt for a long time but couldn't always prove. That beneath the surface of routine traffic stops, standard patrols, and just doing my job moments, there's a culture that sometimes sees color before character, fear before facts, and control before compassion. Marcus Reed just happened to be the one who was finally in the right position, with the right voice, to say, enough is enough. But the truth is, Marcus could have been anyone. He could have been your neighbor, your brother, your friend. What happened to him isn't new. It's just finally being seen. And that's what makes this more than just one man's experience. It shines a harsh light on a system that too often protects itself instead of the people. A system where certain communities are policed differently. Where instinct and training collide in ways that hurt more than they help. Where officers like Kelly Turner aren't necessarily evil, but have been shaped by years of unchecked assumptions and unspoken rules that steer them toward decisions they don't even realize they're making. This story forces us to ask hard questions. Not just about the officers involved, but about the policies, the training, and the attitudes that got us here. What are we teaching our officers to see as suspicious? Who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who doesn't? And why are we okay with that? The answers are uncomfortable, but they're necessary. Because until we stop seeing these events as isolated incidents and start recognizing the patterns, nothing will really change. Marcus Reed stood at the center of this storm, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And by doing so, he became a mirror for the rest of us. A mirror we can't turn away from anymore. His experience wasn't just his own, it was a reflection of a broken system that affects countless people across this country. And now that it's out in the open, we have a choice to make. We can ignore it, dismiss it as a one-off, or we can finally start to fix it. Not for Marcus alone, but for everyone who's ever been treated like they didn't belong in their own city. There's a reason injustice keeps finding its way into the headlines, the courtrooms, and the neighborhoods we all walk through. It's not just because bad things happen. It's because too many of us stay quiet when they do. And that silence, whether it's from fear, discomfort, or just not wanting to get involved, is exactly the space where injustice survives. It thrives in the quiet. It grows stronger every time someone sees something wrong but decides not to say anything, hoping someone else will step in, someone else will do the right thing. But often, no one does. That's what makes what happened to Marcus Reed so powerful and painful at the same time. It wasn't just about one officer making one bad call. It was about everyone else who stood around and didn't stop it. The officers who watched him get handcuffed and didn't speak up. The people who saw it from their porches but stayed behind their curtains. Even Officer Jamie Cruz, who clearly recognized Marcus but didn't have the courage to say something in the moment. That hesitation, that quiet, was just as loud as the cuffs snapping around Marcus's wrists. We all like to believe we'd do the right thing when the moment comes. That we'd be brave, that we'd speak out, that we wouldn't let something unfair happen right in front of us. But the truth is, when it really matters, a lot of people freeze. They tell themselves it's not their business. They don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to be the one who steps out of line. And that's exactly how things like this continue to happen. It's not always about active harm, it's often about passive acceptance. Looking the other way. Pretending you didn't hear the comment, didn't notice the tone, didn't recognize the pattern. In Officer Kelly Turner's case, she acted on bias. But it was the silence around her that gave that bias room to grow. No one questioned her judgment until it was too late. No one challenged her, not in the moment, not even afterward until the consequences were staring them all in the face. The system didn't just fail Marcus Reed. The people within it did too, by choosing not to rock the boat, by choosing to protect their own sense of safety instead of protecting someone else's basic dignity. And the truth is, silence doesn't just protect injustice. It feeds it. Every time someone doesn't speak up, the message is sent that the behavior is okay, that it's acceptable, that it's just the way things are. And that message gets heard loud and clear, not just by those doing wrong, but by everyone watching, including the next generation learning what is and isn't tolerated. That's how injustice keeps passing itself down. That's how it becomes normalized. That's how a bad stop turns into a national headline and a community wound that takes years to heal. But what if just one person had spoken up? What if Officer Cruz had stepped forward right away and said, "I know who this man is"? What if a neighbor had come outside and asked what was going on? What if someone in the precinct had raised their voice before things got out of control? It might not have stopped everything, but it would have made a difference. It would have sent a signal that silence doesn't have the final word, that doing the right thing doesn't always have to come after the damage is done. We can't change what happened to Marcus Reed, but we can learn from it. We can look at the silence that surrounded his arrest and understand how dangerous it really is. And we can make a different choice next time. Because there will always be a next time. Injustice doesn't stop on its own. It has to be interrupted, challenged, confronted, and that starts with people finding their voices. It starts with one person refusing to let wrong go unchallenged. It starts with the courage to speak, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky, even when it feels like no one else will back you up. It's not about being perfect. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about not letting fear of making waves stop us from doing what's right. Because the cost of silence is too high. Marcus Reed paid that cost. Countless others have too. But if more people find the strength to speak up, to push back, to hold the line when it counts, then maybe we can start building something better. Maybe silence won't be the default anymore. Maybe the next time injustice tries to thrive, it'll be met with a chorus of voices saying, "Not here. Not again." It's often the little things that set the stage for something bigger. A glance that lingers too long. A question asked with a little too much suspicion. A decision made in the moment, based more on a feeling than on facts. These moments might not seem like much by themselves, but when they're fueled by bias, especially the kind that's unspoken or unacknowledged, they can grow into something serious. Something harmful. That's exactly what happened the day Officer Kelly Turner saw Marcus Reed walking through a quiet Savannah neighborhood. Nothing about what he was doing was suspicious. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding anything. He was just walking. But to Officer Turner, his presence didn't make sense, and that was enough for her to act. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask. She didn't consider that he might live nearby, or that he had every right to be there, just like anyone else. Her gut told her something was off. But that gut feeling wasn't instinct, it was bias. The kind that gets baked in over time. The kind that's passed down in locker room jokes and side comments and stories that always frame people a certain way. It's subtle. It hides behind phrases like, "just being cautious," or "trusting your training." But underneath all that, it's something much more dangerous. It's the belief that someone is suspicious simply because of how they look or where they are. That's how a simple walk home can turn into an arrest. That's how a calm, respectful man like Marcus ends up in handcuffs in front of his neighbors. And once that line is crossed, everything changes. The officers who showed up as backup didn't stop to question the situation. They followed the lead. The handcuffs came out. The radio lit up. The man standing in front of them, who was actually a high-ranking member of Internal Affairs, was suddenly just another suspect matching a vague description. And it all started with something as small as a feeling that he didn't belong. That's what makes bias so powerful and so dangerous. It doesn't always look like hatred or bigotry. Sometimes it looks like professionalism, like caution, like following procedure. But the results can be just as damaging. It sends a message that people have to prove they belong, that they have to earn the right to be seen as innocent. And that's not how justice is supposed to work. Officer Turner probably didn't wake up that morning planning to arrest an innocent man. She likely believed she was doing her job, following her instincts, keeping the neighborhood safe. But that's the problem. When bias is allowed to operate unchecked, it doesn't need bad intentions to cause harm. It only needs moments where assumptions go unchallenged, and where the systems built to protect people forget to protect everyone equally. What's worse is that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was just the first time it had happened to someone in a position to do something about it. Marcus Reed had the rank, the experience, and the knowledge to expose what had been going on beneath the surface for years. That's why his arrest became a lightning rod. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Too many people saw themselves in Marcus. Calm, respectful, still treated like a threat for no reason. And suddenly, those small moments that people had brushed off for years didn't seem so small anymore. One bad assumption might feel like no big deal, but when you add them up, over days, years, generations, they shape the way whole communities are treated. They create patterns. They build a system where the wrong people get punished and the right people stay quiet. And eventually, something breaks. In this case, it broke in public, under the weight of one man's dignity and the community's exhaustion. We have to be honest about how easy it is for these small acts of bias to go unnoticed. We have to be willing to check ourselves, and each other, when we feel that familiar flicker of judgment rise up without any real reason behind it. Because if we don't, those little moments will keep stacking up until they turn into something no one can ignore. The consequences aren't just personal, they're cultural. They affect trust, safety, fairness. They decide who feels welcome and who doesn't. And if we want to build something better, it starts with noticing the small things, because that's where change really begins. Real change isn't about slogans, speeches, or big public promises. It's about doing the hard stuff, having uncomfortable conversations, standing up when it would be easier to stay quiet, and taking responsibility when things go wrong. That's what courage looks like. That's what accountability demands. And it's exactly what Marcus Reed showed the moment those cuffs came off his wrists. He didn't lash out. He didn't threaten revenge. Instead, he stood still, collected himself, and got to work. Because for Marcus, this wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure what happened to him wouldn't keep happening to someone else. He knew change wasn't going to come from waiting for apologies or hoping the system would correct itself. Real change meant stepping into the fire and staying there long enough to make sure people finally felt the heat. What he did next wasn't easy. He called lawyers, reached out to journalists, and opened doors that many people in his position would have been too afraid to walk through. But Marcus wasn't driven by anger. He was driven by purpose. He saw a broken system, and instead of walking away from it, he decided to hold up a mirror to it. He put himself in the spotlight, knowing full well that it would bring backlash, criticism, and more than a few sleepless nights. But he did it anyway. Because someone had to. Because he could. Because accountability doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone refuses to let a wrong be forgotten. His courage rippled out far beyond the walls of that precinct. People across the city started paying attention in ways they hadn't before. Folks who had once felt powerless suddenly felt seen. Parents who had been telling their kids how to survive traffic stops started asking why those talks were still necessary in the first place. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about something bigger, about what kind of community Savannah wanted to be, and who it wanted to protect. And while all of this was unfolding, Marcus didn't stop. He stayed steady, even as the pressure mounted. When officers tried to discredit him, he didn't flinch. When reporters swarmed outside his house, he stayed calm. When old friends warned him to keep his head down, he lifted it higher. Because for him, this wasn't just a personal mission. It was a promise, to himself, to his family, and to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. He knew that courage without follow-through wouldn't be enough. So he followed through every single day. That's where accountability came in. Not just in demanding consequences for what had been done to him, but in pulling back the layers of the entire department. He helped bring buried complaints to light. He sat down with federal investigators and walked them through years of ignored reports and mishandled cases. He filed lawsuits, not just against individuals, but against the very culture that allowed these patterns to thrive. And through it all, he kept showing up, at press conferences, in courtrooms, in front of angry crowds and hopeful communities. He didn't hide from the spotlight. He used it. Meanwhile, inside the department, the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. Officers started looking at their own behavior, their own choices. Some felt defensive, others felt exposed. But many began to ask questions they hadn't asked before. Was this how they wanted to do the job? Was this the kind of badge they wanted to wear? Marcus's actions forced those conversations into the open, and that was the beginning of something new. Because real change doesn't come from fear, it comes from responsibility. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about raising your hand and saying, "We can do better." And that's what Marcus made possible. Not just by demanding better from others, but by modeling what it looks like to demand better from yourself, too. That kind of leadership doesn't come with a title or a paycheck. It comes from knowing that change is slow, it's painful, and it's messy, but it's worth it. Especially when you know that someone, somewhere, will be safer tomorrow because you stood your ground today. That's what courage looks like. That's what accountability sounds like. And that's how real change finally starts to take root. One voice might not seem like much at first. It can feel small, like a drop in the ocean, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. But when that voice speaks with truth, strength, and conviction, it doesn't stay small. It starts to ripple. That's exactly what happened when Marcus Reed chose not to disappear into the background after what he went through. Instead, he spoke up. And the ripple effect of that decision stretched far beyond what anyone could have expected. At first, it was just a few people paying attention. Some neighbors, a couple of curious reporters, maybe a few officers in the department whispering in break rooms. But then the story spread. People shared it online. Local news picked it up. Soon, it was everywhere. Savannah couldn't look away, and neither could the rest of the country. And what caught people's attention wasn't just that Marcus had been wrongfully detained. It was how he handled it. Determined. Focused. He didn't scream. He didn't try to humiliate anyone. He just told the truth, clearly and directly. And in a world full of noise, that kind of clarity hits different. People listened. Then came the protests. Not angry mobs throwing rocks, but citizens, young and old, gathering peacefully, holding signs, chanting his name, calling for change. Teachers talked about it in classrooms. Parents talked about it at dinner tables. Church leaders brought it up in sermons. What started with one voice turned into hundreds, then thousands. People weren't just upset. They were motivated. They were ready to be part of something bigger. Because Marcus had given them something they hadn't had in a long time, a reason to believe their voices could matter too. Inside the police department, the shift was undeniable. Officers who had been content to go along with the status quo started rethinking how they did their jobs. A few brave ones even came forward with their own stories, of misconduct they'd seen but been too afraid to report. Training manuals were pulled off shelves and reviewed. Policies that had gone unchallenged for years were suddenly under a microscope. And all of it could be traced back to one moment. One man refusing to let his silence be part of the problem. City officials scrambled to respond. The mayor held emergency meetings. Council members who'd never said a word about policing before were suddenly calling for audits, reviews, oversight boards. They knew the city was watching. More importantly, they knew Marcus Reed was watching. And whether they liked him or not, they couldn't ignore him. But maybe the most important shift happened in people's hearts. For so long, many had felt like speaking up wouldn't make a difference. That their complaints would fall on deaf ears. That injustice was just part of life. But Marcus proved that wasn't true. He showed what could happen when someone stood firm in their truth and refused to back down. And that gave others permission to do the same. Victims who had stayed silent for years began sharing their own stories. People who had once kept their heads down started lifting them up. And those stories began to pile up, not as isolated incidents, but as proof that the system wasn't just flawed, it was deeply broken. And now, finally, people had the courage and support to say it out loud. What Marcus started became bigger than him. It became a movement. Not just about fixing one arrest, but about changing a culture. A culture that had punished people for speaking up. A culture that had protected silence and ignored pain. That culture was now being challenged at every level, and it all began with one voice that refused to stay quiet. That's the power of speaking out. It doesn't always cause a tidal wave on day one, but it moves people. It wakes them up. And once people wake up, they start asking questions. They start demanding better. They start realizing they're not alone. And that's when real change begins to grow, quietly at first, but with more strength than anyone saw coming. Marcus Reed didn't set out to be a symbol. He just wanted to be treated fairly. But by standing his ground, he gave a city the push it needed to start healing. And all it took was one voice. One ripple. One refusal to let injustice pass unnoticed. That's how movements start. And that's how they carry on. It's easy to think that fixing a broken system is someone else's job. That the responsibility lies with people in charge. Politicians, department heads, or policymakers. But the truth is, real change doesn't happen unless everyone plays a part. What happened to Marcus Reed wasn't just a wake-up call for the Savannah Police Department. It was a mirror held up to the entire city, showing everyone that no one gets to sit on the sidelines when something this serious is happening. Because whether we like it or not, the system is shaped by all of us, by our choices, our voices, and sometimes our silence. You didn't have to be in uniform to feel the weight of what happened. Parents watching the news with their kids saw it. Business owners heard the conversations in their shops. Teachers felt it in their classrooms, where students asked hard questions about justice, identity, and trust. The ripple Marcus created made its way into everyday places, into homes and schools and churches and grocery stores. People began to realize that they had a stake in how their city treated its citizens. This wasn't just about police reform, it was about community responsibility. That shift in thinking sparked something important. Community leaders who had once avoided controversial issues started speaking out. Local churches offered their spaces for town halls and support groups. Small business owners placed signs in their windows that read, "We stand with Marcus." And it wasn't just about showing support for one man, it was about sending a message to the entire city that enough was enough, and that everyone had a role to play in building something better. Even within the department, you could feel the change. Some officers started asking more questions, about their training, their decisions, their instincts. A few spoke out, admitting they had made assumptions in the past, but wanted to do better moving forward. That kind of honesty wasn't easy to come by in law enforcement, where pride and pressure often go hand in hand. But Marcus's story gave people permission to drop their defenses and think about what kind of impact they really wanted to have on the community they swore to protect. At the same time, younger officers, new recruits, and those still in training looked at Marcus as more than a cautionary tale. They saw him as a standard. A reminder of what true leadership looks like, even when it comes from someone outside their immediate chain of command. Some of them started pushing back against outdated mindsets and unspoken rules, asking why things had to be done a certain way, or why certain neighborhoods were treated differently. These weren't big, sweeping acts of rebellion, but they mattered. Because change doesn't always show up as grand gestures. Sometimes it's the daily decision to question, to challenge, to speak up when it would be easier not to. And it wasn't just the police or the protesters. Everyday people got involved too. Folks who had never been to a city council meeting in their lives started showing up. Neighbors started checking in on each other more, having conversations they'd never had before about race, safety, and equality. Teachers incorporated current events into their lesson plans to help kids understand what was happening in their world. Parents talked more openly with their children about what it means to stand up for others, even when it's uncomfortable. The truth is, no one gets to opt out of the community they live in. If we want things to be fair, safe, and just then we all have to be willing to do the work. That means listening when people speak up. That means holding people accountable when they mess up. And it means looking at ourselves, too, not with shame, but with honesty. Because we all carry beliefs and habits that deserve to be challenged. And the more we do that, the more space we create for something better to grow. Marcus Reed may have lit the spark, but it's up to all of us to keep the fire going. Not with anger, but with commitment. With a steady, ongoing willingness to build a city that sees every person as worthy, every voice as valuable, and every mistake as a chance to learn and grow. This isn't just about policy. It's about people. It's about the kind of community we want to live in and the kind of future we want to pass on. And that future starts with all of us, right here, right now. Change sounds good when it's just an idea. It's inspiring when it's written on a sign or spoken into a microphone at a rally. But the truth is, real change, the kind that actually shifts systems and rewrites old rules, isn't pretty. It's hard. It's slow. It pushes people out of their comfort zones and forces them to confront things they'd rather leave buried. But that discomfort, that's where growth happens. That's where something better begins to take shape. After Marcus Reed's arrest and the fallout that followed, Savannah didn't magically become a model of justice overnight. What actually happened was messier, more painful, and far more complicated. Departments scrambled. Officials panicked. Protests filled the streets while officers filed reports behind closed doors, trying to figure out where they stood in all of it. Some people resisted from the start, clinging tightly to the old way of doing things, calling it tradition or order. Others just felt overwhelmed, unsure of what to believe or who to trust. The city was split, and in many ways, still is. That's the part of the story people don't always want to hear. Because it's easier to believe that once a problem is exposed, it can be quickly fixed. But in reality, undoing years of bias, fear, and silence takes time, and a whole lot of patience. It means facing the fact that even well-meaning people can be part of the problem. It means hearing things that sting, admitting mistakes, and showing up even when you're not sure how you'll be received. It's awkward. It's emotional. And sometimes, it feels like it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There were moments after everything happened when it felt like nothing had changed at all. Officers still made assumptions. Neighbors still whispered. Leaders still dodged responsibility. People were tired of fighting, of waiting, of hoping. And that's exactly when it was most important not to give up. Because lasting change doesn't happen in a moment. It happens in the decision to keep going, to keep pushing, even when the spotlight fades and the headlines move on. Marcus understood that. That's why he didn't stop after the protests. He kept meeting with lawyers, showing up at council meetings, working with community leaders, and putting pressure on the people in power. Not for recognition, but because he knew that if he didn't keep the momentum going, the city would quietly slide back into the way things had always been. And so he kept showing up. So did others. And slowly, things did begin to shift. A new oversight board was created. Training protocols were reviewed. Officers were suspended, investigations reopened, and voices that had been ignored for years were finally being heard. It wasn't perfect. It still isn't. But it was progress. And progress, even when it's uncomfortable, is worth fighting for. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some people said it was going too far. Others said it wasn't going far enough. Some just wanted to move on and forget it ever happened. But the people who had lived through the injustice, the ones who had been pulled over, overlooked, or brushed aside, knew better. They knew that pretending everything was fine wasn't the same as fixing what was broken. They stayed in the fight, even when it was frustrating. Even when it hurt. That's what change really looks like. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the hard questions. It's about choosing to stay present in the mess, to stay committed to the process, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Because that's when something real is happening, beneath the surface, where old habits are challenged and new habits are formed. Savannah is still on that path. It's still wrestling with who it wants to be and how it wants to treat its people. But thanks to Marcus Reed, and to everyone who stood beside him, the city is no longer able to pretend that everything is fine. The truth is out there now, and the work has begun. It's not easy. It never will be. But it's necessary. Because the alternative, staying the same, isn't just uncomfortable. It's unacceptable. And if enough people keep choosing progress over comfort, change will keep moving forward, one hard, hopeful step at a time. At the heart of everything that happened in Savannah, from the moment Marcus Reed was wrongfully detained to the citywide reckoning that followed, there was always one clear message rising above the noise. This isn't just one man's fight. It's not just about one department, one neighborhood, or one policy. It's about all of us. Every single person who lives in a community, who walks down a street, who believes in fairness and decency, we all have a role to play. That's what made Marcus's story so powerful. He didn't just ask for justice for himself. He asked all of us to look around, take stock, and decide who we want to be, not just when it's easy, but when it truly matters. Because change doesn't happen by itself. It's not automatic. It's not guaranteed. It has to be pushed forward, carried by people who care enough to stay involved long after the cameras have left. And caring doesn't always mean protesting or filing lawsuits. Sometimes it means listening more closely. Sometimes it means speaking up in a meeting, asking harder questions, voting with intention, or challenging a comment that would have gone unchecked a year ago. It means supporting the people who are doing the work, the organizers, the advocates, the teachers, the community leaders, people who show up every day, often without recognition, to make sure this moment turns into something lasting. Marcus could have chosen to walk away. After the embarrassment and the public spotlight, no one would have blamed him if he had just cleared his name and moved on. But he didn't. He leaned into the discomfort, not because he wanted attention, but because he understood what was at stake. He knew that if he didn't follow through, the system would brush it off, spin it, reframe it as a misunderstanding and move forward unchanged. That's why he stayed in it. And it's why we have to stay in it, too. This moment, and everything it brought to light, won't mean anything if it fades into memory without action. It has to become part of how we live. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of a shared belief that we deserve better. That our neighbors deserve better. That our kids deserve to grow up in a place where they're seen, respected, and protected, not just on paper, but in practice. And that work starts wherever we are. In our homes, in our schools, at our jobs, in our everyday interactions. We may not all hold badges or titles, but we all hold influence. We all have circles, friends, co-workers, family, where our words and actions make an impact. It's in those places that change starts to feel real. It's where the tone of our communities is set, day after day. We also need to keep supporting stories like Marcus's. Not just to learn from them, but to keep the spotlight on the issues that matter. Sharing stories, talking about them, passing them on, that's how they grow. That's how they reach the next person who needs to hear them. And maybe that person will be inspired to take their own small step toward change. That's how movements work. One step, then another, and then another. It's not about being perfect. It's not about knowing all the answers. It's about being willing to care enough to try. About knowing that even if your part feels small, it still matters. A letter sent. A call made. A vote cast. A conversation that opens someone's eyes. These things add up. They build pressure. They shift culture. And they make it harder for injustice to hide in plain sight. Marcus Reed stood up not just for himself, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked, silenced, or judged unfairly. And now, it's on us to make sure that his voice doesn't echo alone. We get to decide what happens next. We get to choose whether this story becomes just another headline or a turning point. So let it be a turning point. Let it be a spark that lights a fire in each of us, not just for a day, but for as long as it takes. Because justice isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's a promise. And it's one we all have to keep. Together. Every day. In big ways and small ones. That's how change lives on. That's how it becomes real. And it starts, always, with us. The story of Marcus Reed is a powerful reminder that doing what's right often comes with discomfort, but it's necessary if we want to leave a better world behind for the next generation. One of the most important life lessons here is that silence can be just as harmful as direct wrongdoing. Staying quiet in the face of injustice allows harmful systems to thrive. As older adults, many of us have lived through seasons of change and witnessed progress unfold slowly. But this story challenges us to ask, are we using our voices, our influence, and our wisdom to protect others and nurture fairness? It also shows that no one is ever too small to make a difference. Change starts with the courage to speak up, hold others accountable, and reflect honestly on our own beliefs. Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a mentor, or simply a neighbor, your example matters. Compassion, accountability, and fairness aren't just values we talk about. They're choices we have to practice every day. If you were moved by this story and believe in its message, we invite you to take a moment to comment below. What types of real-life stories or topics would you like to see us explore next? Don't forget to like the video if you found value in it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories and reflections like this one. Let's keep learning, growing, and standing up together.